Hey guys. Tonight, we're not trudging through battlefields or dodging plague carts. We're lighting a candle, crushing some mysterious herbs, and inhaling whatever weird smoke just started wafting out of that medieval cauldron. You've stumbled into the side of the Middle Ages. No one warns you about visions, vapors, sacred highs, and maybe a bit of broomstick-fueled sky travel. You're about to spend a night wandering through the foggy intersection of medicine, mysticism, and straight-up tripping. And spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this one with your dignity or digestive system intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin, appropriately enough, by getting suspicious looks from an old woman in a half-timbered cottage. She doesn't speak much, just nods at her herb wall, hands you a mug of something warm and way too green, and tells you to sit near the fire and let the steam hit your soul. This is fine. You're in a modest English village. Circa 1350. The floors pack dirt. The roof leaks slightly. And the entire house smells like rosemary and something more. Peppery. She's what locals call a wise woman, though the line between healer and witch is thin as parchment and often depends on who you accidentally cured last week. You sip. That mug contains more than mint. Your lips tingle. Your vision swirls slightly. Welcome to your first taste of Henbane, a lovely little nightshade that was used for everything from toothaches to talking to angels through the wall. You won't be speaking to angels, but you will be speaking to a chair in about 15 minutes. Medieval villagers used what they had, and what they had were plants. The average herbalist's shelf would make a modern pharmacist faint. You've got mandrake, whose roots resemble little screaming humans. Belladonna, which literally means beautiful woman, used in microdoses to dilate pupils and slightly larger doses to visit parallel dimensions. And don't forget poppy, the same plant that makes modern opium. Yes, it was around. Yes, people used it, sometimes for pain, sometimes for very long naps, sometimes for dreams that involved dancing fish kings. Fringe fact: many of these plants were considered normal to grow in your kitchen garden, just little sprigs of poison and euphoria next to your parsley and leeks. If someone was having visions, folks didn't always reach for the holy water. Sometimes they just assumed you overdid the stew seasoning. You stagger outside, breathing cool night air, trying to blink straight as the moon does a small pirouette, and this was normal. There weren't warning labels or dosage charts. A local herbalist might learn from an older one, who learned from trial, error, and probably a cousin who now lives in a well and talks to frogs. Medieval people didn't have categories like medicinal versus psychoactive. If it helped you sleep and made you dream about flying through a rainbow tunnel filled with turnips, well, so much the better. Historians still argue whether the common use of psychotropic herbs was intentional or incidental. Were they used because of their effects on the mind? Or was tripping just a fun side bonus to a good night's rest? Some think entire folk traditions were shaped by these half-visionary states, especially in communities where literacy was low and storytelling ruled the day. You wander the fields, herbs still swirling in your blood, as the stars dance slightly overhead, somewhere nearby. Another villager is chewing wild lettuce, hoping it numbs his aching knee. He may also briefly believe he's a rabbit. That's the gamble, and in the stillness of the medieval night, freezing cold, utterly dark, but filled with quiet mystery, you realize something strange. It's not just about getting high. It's about connecting to the unknown. When you don't have microscopes or brain scans, you listen to your dreams. You listen to the plants. You listen to the shape of your shadow under a waxing moon and wonder if it's trying to tell you something. Spoiler, it's not. It's just your cloak caught on a bush. Still, the moment lingers. You lie back on a mossy patch of earth and stare into the universe, your head pleasantly spinning. Maybe it's the Henbane. Maybe it's hypothermia. Or maybe, just maybe, this was the only way a medieval peasant could see the stars and feel like they mattered. A moment of transcendence from the dirt floor of history. And your shoes are gone. That's not symbolic. The goat took them. The sun rises slowly, like it's embarrassed about what happened last night. You're lying near a tree, barefoot, mildly damp, and for some reason holding a turnip that seems to be judging you. It's fine. The wise woman finds you, mutters something about city types with weak stomachs, and hands you a bundle of dried herbs wrapped in cloth. Next time, just chew half, she advises. You nod solemnly, like someone who totally remembers what they chewed in the first place. Back in the village, daily life carries on: wood chopping, cow herding, bread baking. But beneath it all, you notice something curious. Everyone, from the aging thatcher to the toothless boy by the well, seems to have a favorite leaf, powder, or flower. Not all for tripping, mind you, but definitely for something. Medieval folks didn't wait for big pharma to show up. Nature was their pharmacy, and sometimes their theme park. You peek inside one particularly cozy cottage and spot bundles of valerian hanging from the rafters used as a sedative. The woman, crushing it into a thick paste, tells you it's for her husband's nerves. He's been jumpy since the last hay cart accident. She applies the mix to his temples and mumbles a chant. Placebo or potion. Who cares, he's snoring in minutes. A few doors down, someone's boiling wild lettuce, which sounds healthy until you learn that in high doses, it acts like a mild opiate. You sip a bit and feel your eyelids do the medieval equivalent of a software shutdown. That plant earned the nickname poor man's opium. Was it safe? Not exactly. Was it effective? You're already napping. So, yes. One street over, an old man lights a bowl filled with dried mugwort, waves the smoke around like he's conducting an invisible orchestra, and announces he's going to dream of dragons tonight. You half expect him to sprout wings on the spot. Mugwort was widely believed to stimulate vivid dreams, especially prophetic ones. Sleep rituals using mugwort were common among herbalists, folk healers, and people who just really needed answers about why their cows kept escaping. Historians still argue whether these herbal customs were passed down through formal channels like monasteries and written herbals, or through purely oral traditions. Likely both. There's enough evidence to show that local healers, especially women, often held deep knowledge about how to use and misuse nature's mind-bending pantry. You stumble across a group of kids playing near a garden wall. They're tossing poppy heads like marbles. You wince. Poppies in small doses were used in sleep potions. In larger doses, they made you hear voices. In too large doses, well, you didn't hear anything again. Somewhere, a cat knocks over a bottle of mandrake tincture. No one notices, probably for the best. You wander into the edge of the woods, where the real forbidden plants live. Deadly nightshade. Its black berries, glinting temptingly. Datura. Used in rituals, but capable of causing confusion. Delirium. Or full-out hallucinations involving time, dilation, and insects speaking Latin. Not ideal. A traveling peddler approaches. Cloak jingling with bottles. "Want to feel like the moon owes you money?" he asks cheerfully, waving a vial of amber liquid. You pass, but only because you still haven't recovered from your night of hallucinating that your horse was reciting poetry. He laughs. "Sout yourself. The bishop bought 2, and that, right there, is the surprising part." These substances weren't just for peasants. Nobles, clergy, even physicians dabbled in the herbally enhanced arts of mood alteration. The line between spiritual and psychedelic experience was often blurry and sometimes intentional. You learn about a traveling herbal mass being held in a glade, a kind of ritual gathering where locals bring bundles of herbs to burn, bless, or both. One woman brings yarrow for protection. Another offers wormwood, known for its use in early absinthe recipes. A third places a sprig of thyme and asks the smoke to clear the shadows from her door. You sit, the air thick with green smoke and ancient belief. Someone starts humming. Another begins swaying. No one's sure who's leading. But it doesn't matter. The feeling of collective, quiet, half-meditation, half-altered state washes over the group like a warm, herbal breeze. You feel light. Maybe floaty. Maybe like that tree over there is watching you. But kindly, open debate still swirls among scholars about how much of these folk traditions were spiritual, how much pharmacological, and how much just the only way people had to explain a world filled with plague, famine, and mysterious night sky explosions. One person's vision was another's divine sign, or Tuesday. The session ends with shared bread, a bit of honey mead, and a group discussion about which plants make your teeth feel like marzipan. It's fennel. Apparently. Don't ask. As the sky darkens and the villagers return to their homes, you feel something old settle into your bones. Not a high. Not quite. But a shift, a realization that medieval life wasn't just short and brutish. It was also deeply imaginative. People reached for herbs not just to escape, but to dream, to hope, to ask questions of the universe they couldn't yet name. You return to the wise woman's cottage. She pours you tea. You ask what's in it. She just smiles. You sip anyway. It's the middle of the night again. You wake to the sound of something bubbling, something grinding, and the unmistakable smell of boiled cabbage and old socks. So, naturally, you're in a medieval infirmary. Welcome to the realm of medieval medicine, where getting high and getting healed were often the same thing, whether you asked for it or not. The healer, a man with 2 teeth, 3 scarves, and 0 sense of proportion, leans over your straw bed. You've got imbalance of humors, he says, poking your forehead like he's pressing a doorbell. We'll fix that with warm leech wine and a little poppy infusion. You try to protest. He's already feeding you something that tastes like dirt mixed with regret. See, medieval medicine was based on humorism, the idea that your body is governed by four fluids: blood, flame, black bile, and yellow bile. Any imbalance among them meant trouble, and balancing them often involved vomiting, sweating, bleeding, or tripping absolute medieval balls. Poppy syrup was a staple in many treatments. It soothed pain, calmed nerves, and sent you somewhere between sleepy and talking to ceiling dragons. Physicians like Avicenna and Hildegard of Bingen documented its use extensively, but let's be honest, they didn't exactly run clinical trials. One patient's miracle was another's deeply confusing trip to the hayloft. The next patient stumbles in clutching his head and muttering about phantom hammers. He's handed a dose of crushed henbane in warm ale. Moments later, he's describing how the fire is singing madrigals. You're starting to think the fire might have a point. You peek at the table lined with dried plants, powders, vials, and a suspiciously large mortar and pestle. You see, mandrake root again, revered for its anesthetic properties, is feared for its supposed shriek when uprooted. In fact, the legends went so far as to say you needed to tie a dog to the root and let it pull it free while you stood at a safe distance with your ears plugged. Historians still argue whether that's just folklore or a legitimate attempt to not hear your own vegetables scream. The healer mixes belladonna into a paste and rubs it on a soldier's bruised shoulder. This'll help him sleep, he says. And sure, sleep is technically what happens after passing out face first into your soup bowl. Let's not forget thornapple, also known as Datura. Used carefully, it could induce vivid dreams. Used carelessly, it could convince you your soup bowl was your mother. Many medieval doctors were essentially walking chemistry experiments with zero safety goggles. You start to understand something crucial about the time period. There wasn't a clear line between healing and hallucinating. If it made you feel less pain, made you forget, or made the room stop spinning or spin in a more entertaining direction, it was considered a win. A monk walks in, clutching a small wooden box. He offers it to the healer, who sniffs, grunts, and hands it to you. Inside, dried blue lotus. Imported. Expensive. Rumored to bring euphoria and mild hallucinations. It was sometimes added to wine or used in tonics for anxiety. You sip. You smile. You float. Not literally. But you do spend the next 10 minutes feeling like your fingers are full of sunshine. The monk laughs and says, "You'll be fine. Just don't write anything down." Last guy wrote a 300-line poem about how soup is God. Of course, the church had opinions. Publicly, many clergymen decried the use of bewitching herbs that clouded the mind. Privately, let's just say that monastic gardens were often suspiciously lush. Some monks even grew psychoactive plants under the guise of botanical study. Others brewed herbal liquors that may or may not have caused full-body tingling and unplanned naps during Vespers. Open debate remains among scholars about how deeply monastic life incorporated altered states. Was it for true spiritual experience, or just a side effect of drinking anything that sat in a clay pot too long? You wander the infirmary. Now, less infirm, but more wiggly. In the corner, you find a physician's notebook. The handwriting is illegible, of course, but there are sketches, plants, diagrams, a very enthusiastic drawing of a smiling moon labeled "Therapeutic Friend." A side note reads, "Patient reports seeing colors in numbers," recommending more fennel and less screaming. You hear music. Not from the street. From the rafters. You glance up. There's a pigeon. You stare at it for a full minute. It stares back. You nod to each other. You're not sure why, but it feels right. Eventually, the healer offers you a final cup. "This will ground you," he says. "It's got honey, sage, and something bitter you can't quite place." You sip. The floor feels more real. Your fingers stop humming. Outside, the sun is rising again. The infirmary door creaks open behind you. You walk away clearer than you expected, not because of divine insight. Not because the herbs cured you, but because you got a glimpse of how people survived here when pain was constant. Explanations were scarce. And escape just for a moment was a gift. You turn one last time and wave at the pigeon. It bows. Respect. You take a winding dirt path out of the village, past hedges that look like they've been trimming themselves out of spite, and head toward the monastery. Not for confession. Don't worry. Your turnip hallucination episode wasn't technically sinful, but to investigate a quieter, the more fragrant mystery, how monks and mystics used herbs, incense, and maybe a little accidental alchemy to get really close to God. The building is stone and solemn, draped in ivy, with a bell that chimes just a few seconds slower than you think it should. Inside, monks glide silently in brown robes, their feet barely scuffing the cold floor. They're singing, and, as the voices echo gently off ancient arches, you realize you're already starting to feel light again. It's the smoke from every dark corner. Sweet curls of incense rise ambergris, frankincense, myrrh, sometimes lavender or sage, a monk pass, swinging a censer on a chain. The glowing coals inside, releasing a scent that's warm, spicy, and just barely dizzying. You breathe it in deeply, and suddenly, the stone walls feel softer, and the hymns settle into your bones like lullabies. Fringe fact: some of these incenses do have mild psychoactive effects. Burning them in a poorly ventilated chapel for hours while fasting, that's a recipe for divine visions or lightheaded swooning. Depending on the monk's lung capacity, you join a group in the scriptorium. They're copying ancient texts with painfully tiny handwriting and even tinier patience. One monk offers you a whiff of cosmary, an herb tucked into manuscripts to help keep monks awake and alert during long copying sessions. You sniff. It's minty. It's sharp. It's kind of a brain slap. Another scribe admits, with a sheepish grin, that he adds a tiny bit of wormwood to his evening tea. For dreams, he says, and for, well, night troubles. You nod, pretending to understand. You absolutely don't. You're invited to Vespers. The chanting is rhythmic, low, and deeply hypnotic. The air is heavy with spikenard, a strange, musky scent mentioned in the Bible and believed to help open the mind to spiritual messages. After an hour, you find yourself swaying a little, thinking deeply about candlelight and your left elbow. You're not sure why, but it feels important. Historians still debate whether mystics deliberately used mild mind-altering substances to achieve visions. Some scholars point to records from certain orders where monks claim to see angels, flaming wheels, or prophetic animals during prayer. Others argue that the combination of fasting, intense concentration, sleep deprivation, and smoke-filled rooms was enough to push the brain into a naturally altered state. You meet Brother Henri. He's got wild hair, kind eyes, and a deep fondness for angelica root, which he says helps him hear the whispers. You're not sure whose whispers, but he seems balanced, calm, and genuinely serene. He talks about the thin places, those moments in meditation where the veil between heaven and earth seems nearly transparent. He invites you to sit with him under the yew tree at dusk and just breathe. You do. And something shifts. The light dims. The air hums. You don't hallucinate. You don't float. But for a moment, you feel very here, like your heartbeat matches the wind, and even the squirrels are in on something bigger. When you open your eyes, Brother Henri hands you a leaf, lemon balm. He says, for clarity. You tuck it behind your ear. You don't feel clearer, but you smell like tea and wisdom. Later, in the library, you come across an illuminated manuscript with a curious illustration, a woman in a long dress, flying through the air on what looks like a broomstick, trailed by vines and stars. Beside her is a list of herbs. Some you recognize: Belladonna, Henbane, mandrake. Others are more obscure and half smeared with ink. The margin note reads, used for nighttime travel of the spirit. You close the book gently. The monk beside you chuckles. Don't try that recipe. Sister Agnes did once. Slept for 3 days and swore she met St. Christopher's dog. The church officially condemned witchy behavior. But unofficially, many monastic records show deep curiosity about dreams, visions, and mystical insight. Some mystics, like Hildegard of Bingen, even describe their ecstatic experiences as mandated by divine will visions that came during deep meditative states, often while surrounded by herbs, chants, and candlelight. So what counts as prayer? And what counts as psychedelic enlightenment? You ask a monk that exact question. He shrugs. If it brings you closer to the divine and doesn't leave you naked in a tree, it's probably fine. You stay one more night. The evening tea has a bit of valerian and something called holy basil. You sip slowly, lying in a cell lit by one candle. The stone beneath you is hard, but your thoughts float soft. You drift somewhere between dream and waking, as ancient voices sing behind your eyes and incense curls into lullabies. It's not a trip. It's not a vision. It's just peace. And for medieval people, that was sometimes the rarest high of all. You wake up beneath the monastery's yew tree, head rested on a patch of moss, with a small sprig of rosemary tucked behind your ear, courtesy of Brother Henri. No doubt, for remembrance. He probably said, and, ironically, you have no memory of how you got here. But that's par for the course when you've been accidentally microdosing sacred herbs with monks for 48 hours. Today, though, you're leaving the safety of incense and Latin chants behind. You've heard whispers of something more illicit, more scandalous, and let's be honest, more fun, the infamous flying ointments associated with medieval witches. That's right, we're going to talk about broomsticks, Belladonna, and the weird, slippery slope between herbal medicine and being accused of summoning Satan. You follow a crooked path out to the edge of a damp forest, where someone's cottage leans so precariously, it's basically moonlighting as a spiral staircase. Inside, a woman in her 60s is grinding something in a mortar while wearing 7 layers of wool and what appears to be a bird skull on a necklace. "You're late," she says. You're not sure for what. But you apologize anyway. The air smells intoxicating. Not sweet like monastery incense, but spicy, earthy. With a little hint of this, might be illegal in several kingdoms. You look at the ingredients laid out: Belladonna, Henbane, Wolfsbane, and Datura. Yes. Again, because medieval witches and even some herbalists who didn't identify as such were concocting flying ointments from these plants. They weren't for broomstick joyrides through the moonlight, or were they? According to many trial records, inquisitors believed witches used these salves to anoint their bodies or brooms and fly to sabbats, those forbidden nighttime gatherings where people danced, feasted, and, allegedly, made deals with devils. But modern historians, they suspect something else entirely: a powerful blend of transdermal drugs that induced wild hallucinations, disassociation, and a very real feeling of flying. And yes, these substances can be absorbed through the skin. The ointment is warmed over a candle. The woman offers a dab for your wrist. You hesitate, but she just rolls her eyes and does it anyway. "You'll see," she says cryptically. "Or maybe you'll just nap really hard." You sit. The tingling starts almost immediately. At first, it's just warmth, then a kind of floating sensation. You close your eyes and suddenly you're not quite in your body anymore. Not falling, not rising, just hovering. You feel like you could step into the air and keep going. Weightless as smoke. And here's the wild part. This wasn't rare. Accusations of flight pop up all over early modern Europe, especially in the 15th and 16th centuries. And some of them include disturbingly specific detail: people describing visions of forests made of light, beasts that spoke, or cities made of mirrors. These weren't your garden variety nightmares. Historians still argue whether these experiences were rooted in genuine drug use, mass hysteria, coerced confession, or some complicated mix of all three. Were accused witches actually using psychotropics to induce trance states, or did inquisitors, obsessed with building their narrative, project these fantasies onto terrified people? And, of course, gender plays a role here too. Women, especially midwives and herbalists, were disproportionately accused of witchcraft. They were the ones who knew how to mix herbs, how to ease pain during childbirth, how to cure nightmares with smoke and teas. In a world where unexplained healing looked a lot like power, it didn't take much for that to be labeled demonic. You open your eyes. You're still on the stool, but your fingers feel like they're humming. The woman hands you a tea. "To come back," she says. It's bitter, grounding, and tastes vaguely like moss. You don't ask questions. You thank her. She shrugs. "Don't tell the bishop," she says. Then she grins. "Actually, do. He could use a little floating." On the way out, you trip over a broomstick. It's just a stick. No magic. But you feel weirdly grateful anyway. In the fields beyond her hut, you find carvings on trees, symbols, spirals, runes that likely predate the church. People once believed in plant spirits, moon cycles, and the idea that flying wasn't just physical. It was spiritual, and sometimes medicinal. You sit under a hawthorn tree and think about it, all the smoke, the ointments, the fear, how something as simple as a salve made from common herbs could be both healing balm and evidence of devilry. How women like the one you just met could be seen as dangerous for knowing too much about roots and dreams. You wonder how many of those accused actually flew, and how many simply needed to. You continue along the muddy track, brushing off the last bit of dream ointment residue and wondering if it's normal for your knees to feel both incredibly light and like pickled turnips. Probably. You're starting to realize that in the Middle Ages, the line between medicine, magic, and mood enhancement wasn't a line at all. It was more like a hand-drawn doodle in the dirt, smudged by a goat. So now it's time to follow that smudge all the way to the Silk Roads, where getting high meant more than just herbs from the hedgerow. It meant imported highs. Baby. You reach a bustling port town, sails flapping, donkeys braying, merchants yelling things like genuine Eastern spices, which definitely includes one guy selling cinnamon that smells like shoe polish. This is where the exotic stuff lands, the powders, balms, and seeds brought across deserts, mountains, and occasionally suspicious-smelling boats, and nestled among the bolts of silk and bags of saffron opium. Yes, the very same substance still causing arguments centuries later. Known as the joy plant, opium had been used since ancient times. But by the medieval period, it was filtering into Europe through Arab medicine, Persian traders, and Venetian smugglers who probably wore too many rings. European apothecaries started, including it in pain remedies, sleep aids, and, let's be honest, in stuff that just made you feel a bit fabulous. You wander into an apothecary's shop that smells like pepper and longing. The shelves are lined with tiny vials, each labeled in Latin tinctura thebaca, laudanum, papaver somniferum. The shopkeeper is part pharmacist, part put, and entirely too pleased with himself. He offers you a tiny glob of opium mixed with honey and ground rose petals for a gentle evening. He says, you take it. 10 minutes later, the world slows. Not in a bad way. You're not melting into the floor. You're just extremely fine. The kind of fine where you can hear your own breathing and think, wow, that's the best sound I've ever made. You lean against a barrel and contemplate the meaning of barrels for a solid half hour. Fringe fact: opium wasn't taboo yet. In fact, many doctors regarded it as a miracle substance. The famous Persian polymath Avicenna recommended it extensively. It made its way into early European pharmacopoeias, and some noble households even had sleep lozenges that were, frankly, just chic narcotics wrapped in parchment. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of opium was mostly medical or increasingly recreational. Records show monks using it for pain relief during surgeries, but also nobles requesting it by name when dealing with melancholy or mild spiritual disorientation, which sounds like a medieval version of I just can't even. And this imported high came with a touch of mystery. The exoticism of the East gave opium an aura of magic. Europeans didn't always understand its chemistry, but they respected its effects, which is to say, they absolutely overused it. A 14th-century Italian merchant reportedly dosed himself nightly and claimed it gave him dreams of paradise. You suspect his definition of paradise may have been extremely horizontal. You continue down the market, and a man tries to sell you betel nut from India. Makes your teeth red and your heart dance. He promises. You pass. Another offers khat, a stimulant from East Africa. One woman quietly slips you a packet of something powdered and claims it's camel spice, which you're 99% sure is a scam, and 1% afraid isn't. The more you explore, the more you realize that people weren't just trading silk and sugar. They were trading states of mind. And in a world that had no antidepressants, no caffeine addiction rehab, and definitely no Netflix getting your hands on a mood-shifting substance could be the difference between daily existential dread and mild, floaty contentment. Back at the docks, a sailor offers you bang, a cannabis mixture from India, carried across via spice traders and sometimes consumed by those curious enough to try the green goddess. It was rare, but not unheard of. Medieval texts mention leaves of laughter, herb of the poets, and other euphemisms that hint at cannabis slipping into Europe centuries before it became, well, a t-shirt logo. You sit beside a cart stacked with sacks of myrrh, watching two cats fight over a fish head, and reflect. These substances weren't just indulgences. They were woven into daily life, ritual, and healing. The same merchant who sold opium might sell licorice root for coughs, or myrtle for cleansing rituals. The same housewife who used poppy syrup to soothe her child's fever might quietly keep a second bottle for when the world felt too sharp. It wasn't about escape. Not always. Sometimes it was about coping with a world filled with plagues, famines, and the ever-present possibility of being exiled because your nose was too suspiciously attractive. You get up, your joints jelly soft, and drift through the marketplace with the ease of someone who no longer fears cobblestones. The sun sets behind stained glass windows of a distant church, the smoke of cooking fires rising like incense from alleyways. And for the first time in days, you don't feel like history is pressing down on you. You feel like you're floating right through it. You leave the docks under cover of dusk, slipping out of town before anyone tries to sell you powdered unicorn horn or authentic dragon breath in a bottle. You've had your fill of exotic highs for the day, though part of you still isn't totally convinced your ribs aren't made of licorice. You head inland, into quieter country, where the markets are smaller, the cows outnumber the people, and highs are more homemade. You arrive at a harvest festival in full swing. There's laughter, lute music, jugs of questionable cider, and at least 3 old men passed out beside an overturned wheelbarrow. This, you realize, is where a different kind of getting high happens, one soaked in booze, baked in bread, and passed around in tankards, fermentation, nation, medieval, Edison. You're handed a goblet before you can say no. It's warm, spiced, and tastes like someone let an apple argue with a clove for 20 minutes. Mead, fermented honey water, possibly the oldest booze on the continent, and still very much alive in the hands of slightly tipsy villagers with a fondness for calling everything ye old something. You take a sip. Your eyebrows lift involuntarily. Not bad. See, medieval people drank alcohol constantly, not just for fun, but for survival. Water could be contaminated. Ale was safer. Even children drank it, though theirs was weak small beer with barely enough alcohol to make a kitten burp. But adults brew stronger stuff. They added herbs to infuse their beverages with everything from flavor to mild psychoactive kick. There was ale with bog myrtle, which, despite sounding like a witch's cousin, packs a little buzz. Gruit beer with yarrow and rosemary, and wines fortified with spices and odd roots no one could confidently identify. Fringe tidbit: some peasants fermented bread mash and drank it out of scooped-out turnips. You're not offered this, thankfully, but someone does hand you a flagon labeled witch's cordial. It's green. You make a choice. It's awful. You ask a brewer what's in it. Oh, just some mugwort, lovage, and a kiss from the moon, she says. You assume that last part was figurative. Probably. You move to the bonfire, where songs are being sung slightly off-key, and someone is attempting to juggle chickens. You take a seat beside a group playing a game called Truth, Lie, or Poppy. The poppy part involves chewing a seed cake that might contain an extra ingredient. You chew. Then you stare very intently at the flames. Historians still argue whether alcohol use in the Middle Ages leaned more toward casual intoxication or cultural necessity. There's no doubt people got tipsy. Plenty of medieval sermons complained about drunkenness, but many communities also considered ale a nutritional staple. In fact, alewives, the women who brewed and sold beer, were crucial to local economies, and occasionally accused of witchcraft when their product was too good. Suspicious that you stand to stretch and accidentally sway into a passing pig. The pig doesn't mind. He's eating a spilled pie and probably feeling spiritual. As you try to walk off your warm buzz, you're invited into a tent with low lamplight and walls made of stitched-together wool. Inside, a man in a robe who introduces himself as Brother Gregory, but not the church kind, offers you something called herbal metheglin. It's mead brewed with medicinal herbs, sometimes sage, sometimes thyme, occasionally something more playful. You drink. Your tongue goes numb. You giggle. The walls seem to pulse slightly, like the tent is breathing. Brother Gregory says this batch contains a touch of wild thyme and betony, believed to open the mind and calm the spirit. Good for thinking about God or goats, he says. You're not sure which you're doing. Later, under the stars, someone passes around a pipe. Not tobacco, it hasn't reached Europe yet, but a blend of local herbs meant to clear the lungs. You take one puff. Your lungs do not feel cleared. They feel very judged. You cough. Everyone laughs. And someone hands you another drink to fix it. The night winds down, with stories told in circles, tales of fairies, ghosts, herbs that make you dream of flying wolves or singing rivers. A grandmother tells you she once brewed tea so strong it made her chickens speak French. You nod respectfully. This isn't a hedonistic rave. It's not even a party in the modern sense. It's community. It's medicine. It's ritual. The line between celebration and ceremony is blurry when everyone's drinking something that's part healing tonic, part escape hatch. You lie down near the fire, cloak wrapped around you, the sky spinning gently above. A child sleepily places a daisy crown on your head. You accept your role as woodland overlord without protest. And as you drift, you realize the Middle Ages weren't just dark times full of plague and pitchforks. They were also full of laughter, warmth, odd herbal cocktails, and an endless human craving to feel better, or at least feel different for a little while. The sun rises, like it forgot to set properly, casting a soft gold over the dew-soaked grass, and the very enthusiastic rooster currently screaming in your ear. You wave vaguely in its direction, brain still fuzzy from mead, mugwort, and whatever that green witch's cordial was laced with. Your daisy crown has wilted. Your boots are missing, and there's a goat sleeping on your arm. Medieval festivals are no joke. You sneak away before anyone tries to crown you again or recruit you for turnip jousting, making your way through the woods to a quieter kind of altered state. Today, it's not about wild salves or potent brews. It's about pilgrimage, the long, deliberate, foot-blistering walks that medieval people took for healing, hope, or maybe just a break from the chaos of life. You meet your first pilgrim before you've even reached the crossroads. She's wearing layers of linen, a scallop shell on her cloak, and a look of patient determination only possessed by someone who's walked 200 miles on soup and prayer. She tells you she's heading to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, hoping for a cure to her son's night terrors, or at least a miracle that lets her sleep through one rooster-filled dawn. You join her. As you walk, she tells you stories not just of saints and relics, but of what people experience on these long journeys, visions, emotional releases, and a strange euphoria that comes from weeks of walking, fasting, and sleeping on hay next to someone who snores like a forge bellows. Pilgrimages weren't always religious spa retreats. Sometimes they were a punishment, sometimes a political statement, but often they were deeply personal. People sought healing not just from illness, but from grief, guilt, despair, and along the way, something peculiar often happened. They tranced out, not in the rave sense. There's no glow sticks here unless you count fireflies. But in the way your mind gets, when your body is exhausted and your senses are dulled by repetition, hours of walking, days of silence, minimal food, soft chanting. It's a slow slip into a state that feels different, dreamlike, a little disconnected, a little divine. You arrive at a roadside shrine. A crumbling stone statue of the Virgin stands beside a hollowed-out tree stump filled with offerings, flowers, bread, tiny wooden carvings, a coin or two. Your pilgrim friend kneels, mutters a prayer, and lights a candle. The flame dances even though there's no wind. You sit beside her, not to pray, necessarily, but to rest. And that's when you feel it, that subtle shift, the warmth behind your eyes. The way the candles glow seems oddly rich, like gold in a dream. You're not high, but you are elsewhere. Fringe detail. Medieval people often describe these moments as thin times or openings, states where they felt closer to the divine, to the spiritual, to something vast and invisible. Fasting helped. So did walking, chanting, and emotional release. Some even combined it with herbs, but even without them, the effect was real. Historians still debate how much of this was true religious ecstasy versus a combination of malnutrition, dehydration, and sleep deprivation. One chronicler wrote of a woman who saw the Virgin Mary on the 12th day of walking with no shoes and only leeks to eat. Divine vision or leek-fueled fever dream, you decide. You sleep that night at a wayfarer's inn, a long wooden hall shared by dozens of snoozing pilgrims and one extremely dramatic dog. The air smells of wax, Vetvol, and a faint herbal musk. Someone's brought valerian in a pouch. For dreams. Probably. Or fleas. Could go either way. That night, you dream vividly. Of green hills and silver rivers. Of faces you've never seen but feel like you've always known. Of walking not to a destination, but into a feeling. A letting go. A floating. You wake, calm. The pilgrim is already gone. Off toward Canterbury or Compostela. Her step steady with purpose and blisters. You eat bread. Wash your face in a freezing stream. And resume walking. Somewhere along the road, you find a group singing quietly as they move. Psalms. Maybe. Or just old folk tunes with new sacred lyrics. Their voices blend into a gentle hum that stays with you. Like a song you forgot, you knew. Your body aches. But your mind, clearer than it's been in days. And this, you realize, is its own kind of high. Not euphoric. Not ditzing, but elevating. Pilgrimage strips you down. Slows you down. And then, if you let it build something new in the silence, you stop at a stream. You drink cold water from your hands, and, for once, you don't worry if it's clean. You just drink, because in this moment, even the water feels like it understands something ancient. By now, your feet have developed the texture of boiled parchment. Your shoulders are sunburned in the shape of your satchel strap. And you've memorized at least 300 ways to say, ow, in Latin. So, naturally, it's the perfect time to stumble across a traveling mystery play troupe, a ragtag bunch of actors, musicians, carpenters, and one extremely dramatic goose named Gregory. They're setting up in a dusty village square, hammering wooden boards together with the kind of confidence that suggests nothing's been measured. A painted banner flaps overhead, the martyrdom of St. Eustace. With comedic interlude, you stop to watch, partly out of curiosity, partly because your knees have officially filed for divorce. And here's where things get weird in the best way. You think you're just watching a play, but within minutes, you realize the audience is reacting like something bigger is happening. People gasp, weep, sway. A woman beside you clutches her chest and whispers, "I feel the fire of God in my belly," which might just be the ale talking, or might be something more. See, medieval theater wasn't just entertainment. It was immersive. These plays, especially religious ones, were deeply sensory experiences. There was incense. There were bells. There were costumes with actual animal bones sewn in. And if the script called for fire, they lit real fire. If it called for demons, you bet someone showed up in goat horns, screaming Latin backwards while jumping out of a barrel. Sensory overload was part of the point. Audiences didn't just watch. They felt. The line between audience and performer blurred. Between acting and worship. Between imagination and reality. And, depending on the show, they sometimes experienced what we might now call collective trance. You watch a scene where angels descend on ropes that creak ominously and bathe a kneeling man in candlelight and smoke. The music swells, a low chant rising behind it. And suddenly the whole square feels like it's vibrating. You're not high. Exactly. But you're not either. Fringe tidbit. Some actors rubbed herbal salves into their temples before performances. A blend of sage, rosemary, and sometimes mugwort or hyssop meant to open the inner eye and connect more deeply with the role. Historians still argue whether this was spiritual practice or just medieval method acting taken too far. One source even claims an actor playing Satan once passed out mid-performance after accidentally inhaling too much holy smoke. The audience, thinking it was part of the act, cheered. He later described seeing 1,000 angels, all of them slightly sarcastic. As night falls, the second act begins. Torches flicker. A man in a crown of thorns takes center stage, flanked by robed figures, singing in minor chords. The atmosphere thickens. Several audience members fall to their knees. One starts weeping. And even you, hardened pilgrim that you now are, feel your throat tighten and your breath slow. It's performance. But it's also ritual, and it's working. You wander backstage afterward, stepping around props and chickens. A woman dressed as the Virgin Mary offers you a cup of something herbal and warm. You ask what it is. Chamomile and marjoram. She says, good for shaking off visions. You sip. Your fingers tingle. You help pack the set. They invite you to walk with them to the next town. You agree. Because what else are you doing? Really? Plus, you hear Gregory. The goose performs miracles, or at least honks on command. Along the road, they sing. They rehearse. One actor tries to teach you how to fall dramatically, but you mostly just actually fall. They laugh. You don't mind. You camp in a field under a bright moon. A lute is passed around. Someone tells a story about a saint who turned invisible by eating pickled lavender. He only did it once. They clarify. Poor choice. You lie on your back, watching clouds drift like stage curtains across the stars, and it hits you. Medieval people didn't have movies or VR or 25 tabs open in their brain, but they knew how to lose themselves in song, in scent, in stories told by firelight. They knew how to gather in a square, stare at a stage, and let themselves believe, even if just for a moment, that something sacred had walked among them. You close your eyes. The wind hums. The torch smoke still clings to your cloak, and you dream of angels with goose wings, descending not from heaven, but from rope swings and fog machines and 1,000 years of imagination. Morning finds you in a dewy meadow, cradling a goose like it's a hot water bottle, and wondering if last night's miracle play was real or just the world's most theatrical group hallucination. Either way, you feel oddly restored. Your joint don't ash. Your mind is light. And Gregory the Goose has apparently adopted you, for now, but today, I are headed to a different kind of communal high, the medieval healing retreat. You wander into a quiet valley, nestled between hills, where rumors say a group of religious mystics and herbal healers run a hospitium, a mix of clinic, sanctuary, and halfway house for the spiritually and physically wobbly, a place where prayers are whispered over teas, and people speak in metaphors about their livers. At the gate, a nun in robes, the color of pond moss, greets you with, "Are you here for rest, revelation, or release?" You blink, say yes, and she nods solemnly. This way, inside, the grounds smell like rosemary, wood smoke, and faint lavender, not in a cute, boutique candle. Way more like the whole place is infused with herbs. as if the air was steeped overnight. You're shown to a straw mattress, given a woolen blanket, and offered a tincture for clarity. It tastes like dandelion and regret. This place runs on three things: ritual, rest, and plants. Every hour has a purpose. In the morning, you're woken with sage steam inhalation. At midday, there's broth spiked with valerian root. In the afternoon, you sit silently in a stone circle, while a woman named Sister Anselma hums and waves a fennel wand over your head. You don't ask questions. You just go with it. And slowly, something shifts. Your breath deepens. Your thoughts slow. You stop obsessing over where your boots went. Gregory the goose is currently nesting in one. You attend a healing service led by a monk with a voice like rain. He doesn't shout. He doesn't preach. He just reads gentle prayers while sprinkling rosewater in the air. As if holiness comes in mist form. You feel tears well up, and you don't know why. Maybe the rosewater. Maybe the quiet. Maybe the fact that someone is playing a harp in the corner with one missing string, and it's still beautiful. Mainstream history tells us monasteries were the hospitals of their time, and it's true. They cared for the sick with rudimentary tools and a surprising amount of herbal knowledge. Plants like feverfew, comfrey, and horehound were staples. The more mystical places added things like fasting, chanting, and yes, herbs that helped open the soul. Fringe tidbit. One medieval healing manual casually recommends placing a toad in a sock and tying it around the neck for throat pain. Sister Anselma says they no longer do that. But they do let you talk to the toads if you want. You do. One is named Bertrand. He's unimpressed. At dinner, you sip a mug of something warm and nutty, made with oat milk, honey, and ground peas. You think that last ingredient might be lemon balm, or maybe placebo. Either way, it works. Historians still argue how much of monastic healing was grounded in botany versus spiritual placebo. Did people actually get better from these herbal regimens and meditative routines? Or was the healing more emotional? More symbolic? Maybe both. Maybe you don't need to cure the plague. You just need to believe you won't die of sadness today. You speak with a young novice healer who shows you her sketchbook drawings of herbs, people in different sleeping poses, and one extremely detailed image of a man she claims turned into a fish for 3 minutes after drinking elderflower wine. You point at it. Did it work, you ask? She shrugs. He said he felt lighter. You get it. Later. You lie in the garden beneath a canopy of apple blossoms. Sister Anselma burns a little angelica root, said to ward off bad spirits and clear dreams. You smell sweetness and earth, and something vaguely cinnamon-like. Your muscles unclench. Your thoughts stretch out like lazy cats. You almost ask if it's okay to feel this good without guilt, but the garden breeze hushes you first. This place isn't flashy. There are no cauldrons or strobe lights, just simple rituals repeated with care, the touch of a warm cloth, the hum of a chant, the way someone looks into your eyes, like they actually see you. That alone feels like a mild drug. You fall asleep to the sound of distant bells. An owl yawning they do. Apparently, and Gregory, gently honking in his sleep. Tomorrow, you'll move on, but tonight, wrapped in wool and silence and rose-scented clarity, you float tethered not to any substance, but to the very human act of being cared for, gently, as if you matter. And sometimes, that's the strongest high of all. You rise before the sun, lured out of bed by the distant sound of bells and the even more distant scent of something baking. Gregory the goose is still asleep in your boot. One wing flopped dramatically across his face like a medieval diva. You slip out quietly, your mind clear, body rested, and soul slightly scented with fennel. Today, you're following the path of knowledge, not through books, but through alchemy. That strange, bubbling overlap between science, magic, and what happens if I boil this until it explodes. And, yes, there were explosions. Often, you reach a crumbling stone tower half buried in ivy, nestled in a secluded grove where the birds have suspiciously stopped singing. A small wooden sign outside reads Laboratorium. Knock before entering. Or don't. Whatever. Inside, it smells like sulfur and burned sugar. You knock. A man in a soot-streaked robe opens the door with the wild eyes of someone who hasn't slept since the last pope died. Are you here for gold? Wisdom? Or spiritual transformation, he asks. You say, yes. He nods like, that's the only correct answer. Alchemy, he explains, isn't just about turning lead into gold, although, yes, they definitely tried. It was a complex web of chemistry, mysticism, philosophy, and metaphor, transforming metals. Sure, but also transforming the self, the base human into the spiritually refined, the gross into the sublime, the Tuesday into something slightly more bearable. Hay ushers you inside, past shelves crammed with flasks, dried herbs, chunks of unknown minerals, and one suspiciously alert-looking ferret. That's Hermes. He says, ignore him. You're handed a cup of something hot and bitter that tastes like cinnamon mixed with medieval student debt. Tonic of mercury, he says proudly. No actual mercury. Anemota. As he works, he mumbles about prima materia, the first matter of existence. The raw, chaotic stuff that everything comes from. In alchemy, the goal is to purify that matter into something divine. The process involves steps with dreamy names: nigredo blackening, albedo whitening, citrinitas yellowing, and rubedo reddening. Sounds like a bad laundry cycle. Is actually a spiritual metaphor. You watch as he carefully combines powders into a bubbling flask. The mixture hisses. The room smells like roasted pine and church basement. Your vision swims slightly. Not from any drug, just from how weirdly serious this all is. Fringe detail. Some alchemists genuinely believed certain herbal preparations, especially ones involving mandrake, sulfur, and wine, could open the mind to deeper cosmic truths. They weren't entirely wrong. Some of those brews probably altered perception just enough to make a bored monk think he understood the universe. Historians still argue whether alchemy was proto-science or high-concept performance art. Did these thinkers actually believe they'd find the philosopher's stone, or was it more about the process, a way to explore the mysteries of existence under the cover of chemistry? You lean over a bubbling concoction that's changing colors like a moody chameleon. The alchemist lets you stir it once. Your stick immediately catches fire. He's thrilled. That's progress. You retreat to a bench made entirely of damp wood and hope the room doesn't explode. Eventually, he brings out a treat, a crystallized confection made from honey, rosewater, and a dusting of sublimed saltpeter. You eat it. It tastes like soap and starlight. You feel slightly elevated, not drug high, but brain-tickled, like a door in your skull, just creaked open a few inches. The alchemist smiles. That's the thing about transformation. He says, it doesn't always come in fire. Sometimes it's a whisper. Sometimes it's a snack. You leave the tower with soot in your eyebrows and a tiny vial of something labeled, "Probably don't drink this." Outside, the world seems sharper, the light more golden, or maybe that's the saltpeter. Either way, you're walking a little taller, a little weirder, and with a growing suspicion that reality is just alchemy with better branding. You pass a grove of elder trees, their blossoms swaying gently in the breeze. In medieval lore, elder was sacred and dangerous, protective and poisonous, used in healing, and sometimes in potions that help seekers see through the veil. You pluck a flower, tuck it behind your ear, and think maybe every plant is a tiny philosopher. That night, you camp by a stream. The stars reflected so clearly in the water, it feels like you could fall upward. You sip a tea made from wild thyme and bay leaf, said to aid dreams of memory. You think of all the transformations you've seen: sickness to wellness, sorrow to laughter, fear to awe. The fire crackles. Gregory honks softly in his sleep, and you drift off wondering, what if the philosopher's stone wasn't gold at all? What if it was just peace? Dawn breaks like a slowly reheated pastry, flaky, golden, and slightly confusing. You sit beside your stream with a mouthful of stale bread and a head full of yesterday's fire-breathing chemistry set. Gregory is pecking the ground with exaggerated purpose, and the little vial, labeled, "Probably don't drink this," glows faintly in your satchel, as if daring you to make a bad decision. You resist. For now, today, if you wander into a monastery, not for herbs or holy visions, but for something arguably more powerful: music. And not just any music. Sacred, medieval, bone-deep, echoing through stone halls music. The kind that vibrates your ribs and convinces you angels might moonlight as choir directors. You step through a low archway into the abbey's cloister, where everything smells of old stone, beeswax, and quiet. A monk in brown robes nods at you and gestures toward the chapel. No words, just a smile and a flick of the wrist that says, "Follow the sound." You do. Inside, the air is cool and dim. Candles flicker like nervous thoughts. Then there it is, the chant. It floats, it shimmers. It doesn't come from one place. It is the place. 10 or 12 voices, smooth as poured honey, gliding through Latin syllables so slowly, your breath instinctively slows to match. The acoustics do something to the sound: stretch it, bend it, layer it. You sit. You listen. You forget what century you're in. This isn't performance. It's not even prayer in the way you expect. It's more like sound therapy for the medieval soul. Gregorian chant was designed not just to honor God, but to alter the listener, to soothe, to elevate, to hypnotize. You're not high. You're haloed, fringe tidbit. Some monasteries reportedly structured their entire day around these sonic experiences: matins, louts, vespers, not just to mark time, But to regulate emotion, chant wasn't just worship. It was mood control. One monk wrote that an hour of chant could soften the grip of wrath and bring the heart to stillness. You believe him? Historians still argue whether medieval chant induced genuine altered states or simply reflected deeply ingrained spiritual conditioning. Was the trance real? Or did the structure of the daily liturgy train monks to feel transcendent at predictable times? Did they ascend, or were they just very good at calm? You step into a side chapel where a lone nun is playing a portative organ, a small, wheezy keyboard instrument that sounds like a harmonica possessed by a particularly gentle ghost. She's improvising slow, wandering melodies that make you feel like you're walking through memory. She stops, looks at you, says, "It helps the plants grow." You nod like you completely understand. She then offers you something wrapped in linen, a sugar cube soaked in violet oil. She explains, "To open the ear." You eat it. Whether it's placebo or plant magic, the next chant you hear hits differently. Your spine tingles. The voices layer in your chest. You suddenly remember a dream. You didn't know you had something about wings and bells and a hallway made of feathers. Later, you wander the garden, where monks move slowly, tending herbs, scribbling marginalia, occasionally pausing to hum a phrase from a chant, like it's stuck in their soul. One points out a fig tree and says, "She sings best in autumn." You don't ask who she is. You just nod. There's something in the cadence of this place. The way time dilates. The way silence stretches like taffy between notes. You catch yourself humming a chant fragment you didn't consciously learn. It slips from your lips like breath, like water by mid-afternoon. You're lying beneath a stone arch, eyes half closed, listening to distant echoing voices and the occasional flap of a bird's wing. Your mind floats, not racing, not dreaming, just drifting. It's not intoxication. It's not ecstasy. It's tuning. Your thoughts have been tuned. The vibrations of this place, its chants, its bells, even the rhythm of footsteps on cold tile, have pulled your brain into a different register, one where time drips like honey and nothing feels urgent. You leave at dusk, not because you want to, but because someone gently rings a bell beside your head and whispers, "Go in peace." You nod, forgetting your name for a moment, and walk down the path with a new rhythm in your bones. And as you head back into the world of mud and mischief, you realize sometimes the most powerful highs don't come from herbs or brews or divine visions. Sometimes they come from silence, repetition, and a room full of voices singing something older than words. The road bends, and so do your thoughts. You've gone from mud hut apothecaries to candlelit cloisters, from mugwort highs to monks in perfect harmony. But now, you find yourself pulled somewhere, stranger still, a place less holy, more hooded. You enter a village whose name you can't pronounce, and whose air tastes of bonfires and boiled onions. Someone points you to a little cottage at the edge of the woods, the kind people usually whisper about. She sees things, they say, knows when to plant, when to bleed. Don't look in her eyes too long. Naturally, you head straight there. She's called a cunning woman, a healer, midwife, seer, and, depending on who you ask, low-key sorceress. The inside of her cottage smells like resin and old books. Herbs hang from every rafter. There's a cat with one eye sitting on a stack of dried foxglove. It blinks at you like it's taking notes. She offers you a stool, a cup of nettle tea, and a single question. What do you want to forget? You blink. You thought you were just here to sniff some herbs and ask about dreams. She waits. Neither warm nor cold. Just present. Like a mirror that also has opinions. And so, you talk. You talk about the road, the festivals, the visions, the goat that judged you, the chant that unzipped your heart, the way time feels elastic and fragile all at once. She nods through it all, adding tiny bundles of herbs to a clay bowl, rosemary, juniper, a curl of bark, something that might be dried, apple, or tongue. Hard to say. She lights it. The smoke rises in slow spirals. And just like that, your thoughts do. Too, the cottage doesn't spin. Exactly. It tilts. Your muscles loosen. Your memories shuffle like a deck of sleepy cards. You feel present and distant at the same time, as though someone has opened a trap door behind your forehead and let the moths out. This is no accident, these women cunning folk. Wise women. Folk healers were the underground therapists of the Middle Ages. They offered potions and poultices. Sure. But also something more elusive emotional medicine. A space to talk. To confess. To laugh and cry, and then be handed something bitter that made you burp up your sadness a little. Mainstream history usually paints them with suspicion, especially when viewed through the lens of church authority. But in rural communities, they were vital. People came for fertility charms, for grief, tea, for something to help the nightmares stop. Fringe tidbit. Some cunning women used dreams as diagnostics. You'd sleep in a poppy-scented bed while she burned yew leaves and whispered questions to your sleeping spirit. In the morning, she'd tell you what your dreams meant and what plant could close the wound your soul forgot. Historians still argue whether these practices were proto-psychology, occult nonsense, or just really effective folk wisdom. Did they work because of the herbs or because of the attention, the ritual, the belief? You sit there, blinking through smoke, and think, does it matter? She hands you a tiny vial. Yarrow and rue. She says, for strength. Don't take it unless you mean it. You pocket it. You're offered bread dense, seeded, almost sewer. It grounds you. You're back in your body now, a little wobbly, like someone who's just climbed down from a very tall idea. You help her gather herbs from the garden. She teaches you their names, not the Latin ones, but the ones with stories: lungwort, lady's bedstraw, dead man's grip. You don't ask about that last one. There's a peace here. But also a wildness. She doesn't deal in angels or saints. Her power comes from roots, from crows, from knowing which way the wind turns before it turns. She's not the villain. She's the one the village pretends not to need, until they really, really do. As the sun sets, she draws a circle of salt around the door and hums a tune that makes your teeth itch. Just in case. She says, of what? Dreams. You thank her. I'll leave with a pouch of oddly warm lavender and head into the woods. The path is soft. Your boots crunch gently over moss. Your thoughts feel sorted. Like the smoke went through your head with a tiny broom and swept things into tidy piles labeled someday. Not your fault. And let it go. The moon rises. Gregory honks once. Solemnly, and you think being altered doesn't always mean being out of control. Sometimes, it just means letting something else hold the wheel for a minute. Something older. Rootier. Wise enough to know when you need yarrow and when you need sleep. The woods thicken as you walk. Leaves, whispering secrets you're pretty sure you're not supposed to hear. Branches overhead form arches like cathedral ceilings, except these drip with moss and the occasional suspiciously damp feather. You're not lost. Technically, you're just following the part of the map labeled, "Here be vibes." Eventually, you stumble into a glade lit entirely by fireflies and one suspiciously well-organized bonfire. Around it sit a dozen people, some in robes, some in furs, some wearing what looks like bed sheets, and absolutely zero judgment. You found a medieval ecstatic dance circle, and you're not even mad about it. There's a drum beating softly, a hand-carved flute sighing into the night air. Someone's clapping a rhythm that refuses to behave. And in the center, barefoot figures move in a kind of sleepwalking grace. Arms swaying, hair unbound, heads tilted like sunflowers tracking a moon. They can't quite see. One of them sees you. Smiles. Gestures. You step into the circle. The ground is soft. The air smells like sweat and wild thyme. You're not given instructions, but you don't need them. You just move slow at first, then looser, like your joints finally remembered they weren't designed for chairs. This isn't a performance. It's a ritual. These people aren't dancing for fun. They're dancing for release. Medieval ecstatic practices weren't confined to one religion or class. From mystic Christian sects to folk festivals in the countryside, there were always those who believed movement could be holy. That shaking, spinning, collapsing to your knees wasn't a sign of losing control, but of touching something bigger than yourself. And sometimes, it was even sanctioned. The flagellants, for instance, paraded through towns, whipping themselves into frenzies, not just with chords, but with movement, chanting, rhythm, less about pain, more about purging. Of course, others took the more joyful route. In parts of Europe, folk dances like the tarantella were said to cure spider bites by coaxing the venom out through wild, sweaty, rhythmic motion. Historians still debate whether the spider was real or just a metaphor for emotional poison. Tonight, it doesn't matter. You dance, the rhythm picks up. Someone adds a tambourine. Someone else throws herbs into the fire, lavender, rosemary, maybe just enough mugwort to make the stars pulse a little brighter. Your heart beats in your ears. Your arms move like smoke. You forget how to stand still. Fringe detail. Certain regions believed ecstatic dance could summon rain, cure fevers, even ward off death. There are records of women dancing until they fainted, claiming they saw angels. There are also records of bishops who watched from a safe distance and muttered something about hysteria. You spin. The air thickens, not heavy, just bore. And then quiet. The music fades. One instrument at a time, until only the crackle of the fire remains. Everyone sinks to the ground, like petals falling in slow motion. Someone laughs. Someone ecrees. One man stares at his hands as if they've just confessed something. You lie back in the grass, chest heaving, eyes wide. Above you, the sky stretches into forever. You swear the stars look closer than usual. A woman next to you murmurs. Your body remembers things your brain forgot, then falls asleep instantly. You don't sleep. Not yet. You just float in that charged silence. The afterglow of movement and breath and firelight. Your fingers twitch with leftover rhythm. Your ribs ache in the best way. You don't feel possessed or entranced. You feel returned. Like some vital part of you came back from wherever it went when taxes became a thing. Historians still argue whether ecstatic states were spiritual breakthroughs, mass hysteria, or a very clever way to get around social norms. After all, who's going to scold you for shouting at the moon if you're doing it for Saint whoever? You finally drift off just before dawn, curled in the arms of the grass and the wind, your heartbeat still echoing the last drumbeat. Gregory sleeps beside you, and you dream not of visions or angels or riddles, but of dancing in a firelit glade with bare feet and open lungs, and waking up, feeling just a little more alive. The sun rises, smeared in orange, like someone spilled marmalade across the clouds. You wake in a circle of scattered bodies, snoring monks, barefoot mystics. One guy still lightly humming. Gregory the goose sits on your chest like a judgmental paperweight, blinking slowly. His honk says, "You danced weird, but it's okay. Everyone did." You wander away from the glade with a stretch and a yawn, and a mental note to ask someone what that herb was. Your legs atch in good places. Your brain feels like it got a full night's sleep and a pep talk from an enthusiastic choir. A few miles on, you stumble upon a gathering of scribes and scholars. These aren't cloistered monks or court philosophers. These are memory masters, people who train the brain like it's a knight preparing for mental jousting. And yes, they sometimes dabble in the mind-altering arts. But their methods are a lot quieter, trickier. They're preparing for a demonstration, a test of ars memoriae, the art of memory. You settle into the crowd just as a man in a red cap steps forward and announces he'll recite all the names of God. Alphabetically, with commentary, he begins. And, honestly, he's good. Like, suspiciously good. Turns out, this isn't just talent. This is technique. The medieval memory palace system, borrowed from classical antiquity and honed in cathedral schools, trained people to construct vast imaginary buildings in their minds, each room holding specific images or ideas. Need to remember a saint's feast day? You place it in your mental garden, next to a statue vomiting fish, because, obviously, fish equals Friday equals saints. The mind wasn't just a storage box. It was a temple. And sometimes, it needed a little herbal encouragement. Fringe tidbit. Some memory students chewed rosemary sprigs while studying, believing it opened the head. Others burned mint, thyme, or laurel during exercises. There's even a documented recipe for a brain balm rubbed behind the ears to help with mental focus made from camphor, ox gall, and crushed almonds. Smelled like academic desperation. You're invited to try. A short, smug scholar hands you a vial of oil and says, "Don't sniff too hard." Last guy thought he was Charlemagne for 3 hours. You dab a little behind your ears. It tingles. You're shown a series of ridiculous images, a lion juggling scrolls, a monk on a unicycle, a talking pier. Somehow, these link to the 10 Commandments. You laugh. Then, you remember. Hours later, you can still recite them backwards. The trick isn't just the herbs or the images. It's the combination of absurdity, repetition, and belief. The weirder the picture, the longer it sticks. It's why you still remember that one goose dream and not where you left your shoes. Historians still argue whether these techniques were spiritual paths, intellectual hacks, or proto-psychedelic frameworks. Some mystics believed each image, each memory, echoed a deeper cosmic truth, like you weren't just learning facts, but aligning with the universe. One scribe lets you peek at his personal book of memory. It's not parchment, it's bark, scratched with symbols that make no sense to you, but clearly mean everything to him. He tells you he once fasted for 3 days to memorize the Psalms. You ask if it worked. No. He shrugs. But I had an excellent vision of a goldfish who explained the Trinity. You spend the afternoon drawing your own memory palace badly. Yours ends up looking more like a crooked tavern with a very dramatic chandelier. But it works. You remember a saint's feast day, the 3rd of August. The herb for headaches, Bethany, and the location of Gregory sleeping in your hat. By evening, the group gathers for what they call a feast of ideas. It's part dinner, part discussion, part mutual head massage. The food is light figs, soft cheese, pickled walnuts. The conversation isn't. Topics range from soul geometry to whether you could sneeze a demon into someone else's dream. You lie on the grass afterward, a sprig of rosemary tucked behind one ear, and realize your mind feels full, but not heavy, stretched, but not snapped. You haven't had a single sip of wine today. No potions. No incenses strong enough to make you see God's elbows. Just imagination, repetition, and a little time oil. And yet, you feel altered, like you've stepped out of the noisy, scrambling brain of your everyday self into something older, quieter, a version of your mind that knows how to linger in thought, how to find joy in memory, how to hold on to an idea long enough to dance with it. Gregory honks in agreement. You take it as a sign. Your palace is coming along nicely. You leave the scribes behind, with your new memory palace wobbling gently in your head like an undercooked pudding. There's a lion in your imaginary kitchen juggling scrolls, a talking pear in your hallway, and Gregory the goose now inexplicably lives in your attic. You're not sure if that was intentional, but he seems happy up there. Today, you follow a different kind of trail, not a forest path, but a procession. Music wafts through the air again, but not soft and reverent like the chants. This is louder, joyful, even a bit chaotic. You crest a hill and see them, a group of pilgrims moving slowly down the road, chanting, singing, clanging tambourines, and dragging what looks suspiciously like a papier-mâché dragon on wheels. Welcome to the weird, euphoric world of pilgrimage. These weren't quiet solo journeys into the wilderness. Most medieval pilgrimages were group affairs, half-holy mission. Half, mobile village block party. You join in without question. A man with an absolutely unhinged haircut hands you a scallop shell badge and a chunk of hard cheese. You're one of us now, he says. Try not to die before dinner. Cool. The road is dusty and long, but it's also alive with ritual. People sing songs to stave off blisters. There's a man muttering prayers to a sock that apparently contains his grandmother's toe bone, you do not ask. Someone else wears a shirt made entirely of knotted cords penance. He says, for being emotionally sarcastic in the presence of a nun. Fair. At waypoints. There are shrines. Some with candles. Some with bones. Some with bottles of strange-smelling oil. You're encouraged to anoint your forehead with one. It smells like basil and garlic, which feels more pasta than piety. But you go with it. Midway through the journey, the group pauses for what can only be described as structured hallucination light. An old man in a pointed hat sprinkles herbs onto a tiny brazier and declares, "This smoke makes the saints visible." Someone coughs. Someone else sees Saint Catherine riding a flaming wheel. You mostly see colors that don't have names. Fringe tidbit. Some pilgrimage sites included not just sacred relics, but small rooms for vision quests cramped. Incense-choked chambers where pilgrims could meditate, fast, or sometimes just pass out dramatically and claim enlightenment. Scholars later called these rooms anchor holds. Pilgrims called them weird little closet that made me cry. Historians still argue whether the trance-like euphoria reported by pilgrims came from divine contact, exhaustion, or just sheer group psychology. After all, walking for weeks in blistered sandals beside strangers, all shouting the same songs, tends to do something to your brain. One woman, eyes shining, tells you she's seen her sins burn away like parchment. You ask how. She says it happened after kissing a sacred rock and eating half a fennel loaf. You nod. That tracks. As night falls, the group gathers around a bonfire. A traveling priest recites a story of St. Brendan sailing west until he found an island made entirely of birds that screamed the psalms. No one questions it. One guy claims to have visited. You're starting to suspect the cheese may have been a bit fermented. You lie under the stars, cradled by song and soot and the collective weariness of 50 people who all decided that walking across half a country with foot fungus and prayer beads was somehow a great idea. And it was, because despite the blisters and the questionable snack choices, you feel something real, something beyond herbs and visions. A sense of movement, internal as much as external, of not being who you were when you started walking, of inching closer to something sacred, even if it's just a deeper version of yourself. Gregory waddles over, feathers singed from sitting too close to the fire, and flops down beside you. He smells faintly of ash and thyme. You don't mind. You close your eyes and breathe in the scent of wood smoke and basil. Body sore, heart full, brain vibrating gently in a way that has nothing to do with drugs and everything to do with walking beside strangers who sang like saints and laughed like fools. And, as you drift off, you realize sometimes the longest journeys don't lead you far. They just lead you home to yourself. Morning breaks with the gentle sound of someone trying to retie a sandal for the 8th time. A pilgrim curses softly in Latin. Another sings through a mouthful of beans. You and Gregory rise with the rest of the pack, smelling like campfire and possibly divine grace. But today, you peel off from the procession, not out of boredom, out of curiosity. Because there's a darker path now, a quieter road that leads through a thicket of rumor and smoke. People lower their voices when they speak of it. They make gestures with their fingers, sometimes crosses, sometimes wards. sometimes just nervous fiddling. You're heading into the tangled world of heresy and how mind-altering experiences could get you very, very burned. You find yourself in a remote valley where a few stone houses sit like secrets. Here, among whispering trees and guarded glances, a small community gathers, not in churches, but in candlelit barns. They speak of visions, of dreams that crack open the heavens, of voices that don't sound like anything from the Psalms. They talk about truth, but it doesn't match the church's version. One woman claims she floats during prayer. Another says she can taste colors when she fasts. You are not the least bit surprised. This group, loosely tied to the ideas of groups like the Beguines or the Cathars, believes that divine knowledge can be experienced directly without priests, without relics, and sometimes without clothes. Though mercifully, tonight, everyone keeps their robes on. They invite you to sit, to drink something bitter and violet-tinted from a wooden cup. It's not wine, and it definitely wasn't made in any abbey. They call it claritas, clarity, not because it helps you see clearly, but because it strips away the layers that keep you from feeling clearly. It's earthy, sharp, and oddly floral. It tastes like licking a dried sermon. And then the chanting begins. Low, rhythmic, with no words you recognize. Not Latin, not French, maybe not even language. Just syllables and breath, building a ladder to somewhere you didn't know you had access to. Fringe detail. Certain heretical sects believed that divine wisdom came through suffering or ecstasy or both. Some practiced intense fasting, sleep deprivation, or exposure to holy plants that made them shiver, weep, or convulse. These experiences weren't sins. They were shortcuts to heaven. Historians still argue whether such altered states were genuinely mystical, early psychological phenomena, or manipulative theater. Were these groups rebels, prophets, or just rural folk with access to potent mushrooms and a lot of unresolved trauma? As the chants swell, you feel a shift, not a chemical one this time, but emotional. The way a story starts to cry through your bones before your brain knows why. Someone places a hand on your shoulder. You don't flinch. You just sit there. A human tuning fork. The fire flickers. A man stands and speaks of a vision. He had a field of mirrors, each one showing a different version of himself. One proud, one broken, one made entirely of feathers. You don't know what it means, but your ribs tighten like they do. And then, suddenly silence. Everyone sits. No explanation. Just a shared stillness. Like they've reached the end of something sacred. You sit too. You and Gregory, who has somehow ended up next to a loaf of dense rye bread and refuses to move. Later, a young woman leans in and says, "They'll never understand us." You ask who they are. She says, "Anyone who's never heard God breathe through fennel smoke." You nod. You get it. But here's the twist: groups like this, they were often labeled dangerous, not because they were violent, but because they dared to feel too much, to believe you could touch the divine directly, that the veil could lift, that truth could come without Latin, or incense, or gold-threaded robes. And for that, many were tortured, burned, erased. You walk away from the valley that night with heavy feet, not because the potion hit you wrong, but because you know how this story ends. The line between mystic and heretic is as thin as a hair. And if your visions don't match the official ones, well, you better not have any witnesses. You lie down in a hollow, near the edge of a hill. Gregory curls beside you. Finally silent. The stars feel sharper than usual. You see one flicker. And you wonder, was it always that color? You whisper to no one. I understand now. And the wind carries it away like a secret prayer, unsure whether to keep it or share it with the moon. Morning comes reluctantly, like a grumpy monk dragging his sandals to morning prayer. Your eyes open slowly. Gregory is already up, sitting on your chest again, looking off into the distance, like he's considering becoming a poet. You stretch, joints popping like a medieval bakery oven full of old dough. You walk into the next town with the kind of half-smile that says you've seen some things and you're not quite done seeing more. This place is larger, louder. There's a market in full swing: apples, fish, herbs, dried frogs. You're not sure whether that last one is for eating, healing, or some sort of amphibian tarot reading. Probably all three. This isn't a sleepy village or a secret sect. This is church territory. Stone cathedral. Pointed hats. Robes that swish when people turn too quickly. And with the church comes rules. Especially when it comes to, well, everything. You duck into a shady apothecary to avoid the eyes of a particularly grumpy bishop. Inside, a thin man with ink-stained fingers is carefully grinding herbs into a powder. For migraines, he mutters, or visions, depends on the dosage. He winks. This, it turns out, is what the church is both publicly condemning and privately tolerating. The line between medicine and mysticism has always been blurry. And when it comes to psychoactive herbs, the hypocrisy is almost impressive. In official doctrine, many of the plants you've seen on your travels, mandrake, henbane, wormwood, are condemned, associated with witches, demons, heresy, or at the very least, indigestion. But behind monastery walls, monks sometimes quietly catalog their effects, growing forbidden herbs in corners of cloister gardens. Why? Because people kept getting results. Need to calm. A screaming nun convinced she swallowed the devil. A drop of poppy extract might help. Want to ease the dying into visions of heaven? Mix a little belladonna with wine. Need to explain why Sister Agnes just confessed to being a phoenix in her past life. Easier to blame a brew than a blessing. Fringe tidbit. Some bishops kept detailed herb confessionals, locked away lists of plants and their effects, often written in a secret code or disguised as botanical poetry. One particularly cryptic entry simply reads, St. John's lily burnt root, blessed hour, mouth of heaven opens. Historians still argue whether these records were sincere attempts to study altered states or just intellectual cover for some very creative monks who didn't want to admit they'd accidentally dosed the abbot during Sunday lunch. You wander through the cathedral library and find books with worn spines and nervous margins. Someone scribbled dangerous when fasting next to a description of dreamwort. Another margin just says, do not inhale, inquire. Good to know. And yet, the church also weaponized these substances when convenient. Accusations of witchcraft often included references to herbal unguents or night-flying brews. And, if you happen to be a woman with knowledge of those herbs, well, good luck not getting set on fire for making someone dream of floating goats. Tonight, There's a sermon. You sit in the back, beneath a crumbling fresco of St. Anthony, resisting temptation while looking suspiciously high. The priest drones on about the dangers of false visions, of dreams sent not by God, but by the devil in leafy disguise. He waves a sprig of rue like it's an exorcism. But afterward, behind the sacristy, the same priest offers you a tiny bottle for sleep. He says, or revelation. You take it, because of course you do. And you realize the church didn't hate the trip. It just wanted to own it, to control who got to have visions, who could speak of angels, who was allowed to interpret the stars or whisper to the wind, or wake up weeping from a dream they didn't ask for. The bottle warms in your hand. It smells like nutmeg and night. You slip it into your pouch and walk back into the market, where a boy is selling candied violets and a woman is laughing, like she hasn't stopped in 20 years. The world is buzzing. Even without the herbs, you look up at the cathedral spire, sharp against the fading sky, and wonder how many visions happened up there that no one ever dared to write down. And how many still do. You leave the cathedral town with your satchel heavier and your brain humming like a low-lit candle. The road ahead is quiet again, and the landscape spreads wide and golden, like the world is exhaling. The air is warm, the sky the color of old parchment, and Gregory walks beside you, his wings tucked like he's on official goose business, as the fields stretch out. Your thoughts turn inward, not to what people used, but to why they used it. What, exactly, did medieval people believe was happening when they tripped, dreamed, or saw visions that weren't supposed to be there? You reach a hilltop chapel just before dusk. It's small, probably only used by shepherds and stubborn saints. The door creaks when you enter, but no one minds. There's a woman sweeping the floor with a branch broom, humming a hymn that probably predates Latin. She looks up, nods once, and goes back to her broom. Inside, the air is thick with beeswax and dried rose petals. Not incense. Not wine memory. This is the kind of place where people didn't just pray. They experienced things. You sit in a worn pew, and suddenly you're surrounded by centuries of questions. Because, in the Middle Ages, people didn't have MRI scans or serotonin receptors or dopamine rush theories. They had angels, demons, the four humors, the alignment of Saturn, the whisper of Saint Margaret in your dreams, a frog that croaked 3 times near your door. A vision wasn't just a fluke of the brain. It was a message from heaven, hell, or somewhere in between. Some people believed these states were punishments. Others believed they were gifts. The Blessed Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century nun and certified visionary, described her revelations as a fiery light that entered her brain without blinding her. She wrote entire theological symphonies based on what she saw. Her visions were embraced because they fit into an acceptable framework. Others weren't so lucky. Fringe tidbit. In parts of Germany and France, local saints were said to appear only after people consumed very specific herbs, like feverfew or spikenard, combined with a strict 3-day fast and sleep deprivation. These formulas weren't just superstition. They were ritual science, mapped out like recipes. Historians still argue whether these frameworks, visions from saints versus hallucinations from sickness, were tools of control or attempts to understand the deeply weird human experience. Did people see what they were trained to see, Or did the plants? The fasting, the chanting truly open something. You walk behind the chapel and find a small herb garden, overgrown, unlabeled, humming with bees. You kneel beside a cluster of mugwort and crush a leaf between your fingers. It smells sharp and ancient. You hold it to your nose and breathe in the kind of scent that once made a nun speak fluent Aramaic in her sleep. There are no fences here. No lines between prayer and plant, between memory and meaning. The herbs were tools. Yes, but also bridges. They let people move between worlds that modern science insists should never touch. You sit on the chapel's back steps and watch the sun dissolve behind the hills. The shadows stretch long. The breeze smells faintly of thyme and rain, and the ash of long-forgotten incense. You remember the dancers in the glade, the cunning woman's smoke, the singing pilgrims, the muttering priest with the bottle in his sleeve. All of them were reaching not for escape, but for connection to truth, to spirit, to a version of themselves that might understand what the waking self could not. Gregory flaps onto your shoulder, sighs, and falls asleep instantly. Apparently, spiritual. Reflection bores him. You lean back against the chapel wall and close your eyes, letting the sounds of the evening wrap around you like a blanket. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings faint, ghostly, probably a cow. But still, a bell. And you think maybe all these altered states weren't about losing your mind. Maybe they were about finding the part of it you usually ignore. The quiet part, the old part, the part that still believes a dream can mean something. A goose can be a guide, and that the line between this world and the next is thinner than a poppy petal. The night wraps around you like wool, soft, and a little scratchy, scented faintly with rosemary and the ghosts of prayers. You rise from the chapel steps and begin the final leg of your journey, not to a place exactly, but to a feeling. The stars above are no longer strangers. You know their names now, or at least the names others gave them when they still believed. Stars were holes poked in heaven's floor so the light could leak through. You follow a narrow path by moonlight, worn smooth by centuries of hesitant footsteps and hopeful sighs. The trail winds upward, toward a high outcrop known only in local whispers as the Listening Stone. No maps. No guideposts. Just instinct and, of course, Gregory, who waddles ahead like he's done this pilgrimage for centuries. Maybe he has. The stone stands tall, taller than you expect, covered in moss and ancient carvings. Some in Latin, some in lines of dots and spirals. One looks suspiciously like a goose. You press your palm to the stone's cool surface and feel something. Not a jolt, not a vision, just presence, a weight, a witness. This is where people once came to speak into the night, to ask questions, to surrender stories, to let the herbs, the chants, the dreams, the dances, all of it fade into something larger. So you do the same. You sit. You breathe. You remember. You remember the giggling apothecaries, the bitter teas, the saints with twitchy eyes, the women who healed with root and whisper. You remember spinning through firelight and seeing yourself in the eyes of strangers. You remember the moment when your mind tipped sideways and you didn't feel afraid. And then, as if summoned by memory itself, you reach into your satchel and pull out the tiny bottle the priest gave you. It's warm now, as if it's absorbed your heartbeat. You uncap it. The scent hits you like a whisper in a forgotten language. Nutmeg. Fennel. Something woodsy. Something that makes you want to cry, but in a good way. You drink, just a drop. And wait, the stars stretch. The stone hums. Your thoughts slow not into silence, but into space. The kind of inner hush where thoughts don't vanish. They just sit beside you. Finally, content not to be the center of attention. And in that quiet, you understand what this whole strange, herb-scented, mud-splattered, history-tangled journey has been about. It's not the potions, not the visions, not even the saints. It's the yearning, the deeply human urge to touch the veil, to peek behind it, to believe that your ordinary, aching, mortal self might be just a little bit more given the right chant, the right route, the right night under the right moon. Fringe tidbit. There were entire sects that believed the soul could leave the body during sleep and travel the heavens, returning wiser or stranger. Some monks claim to have visited purgatory, heaven, and the edge of the void itself, all before breakfast. Historians still argue whether these stories were dreams, drugs, lies, or truths wrapped in metaphor. But the important thing is, they mattered. They shaped lives, decisions, cultures, and sometimes, quietly, they healed people in ways no priest or physician could. You lie back against the listening stone. Gregory hops up beside you and nestles close, beak tucked under wing. For once, no honks, just silence. And then the wind, soft, carrying the scent of all the places you've been mugwort and mint, wax and wine, feverfew and frankincense. It brushes your cheek like a blessing, and your eyes flutter closed. You lie still, breath slow, the last traces of your long journey dissolving into the night air like candle smoke. The stone behind you is cool and firm, grounding. The wind no longer speaks. It simply is a gentle, rhythmic hush that matches your heartbeat, softening everything it touches. Far below, the markets are asleep. The church is silent. The dancers dream. The cunning women stir herbs in their sleep. The saints rest quietly in their paintings. And you are drifting. Let the moss remember your footsteps. Let the chapel remember your prayers. Let the fields hold your laughter. You don't need to carry it all anymore. The world feels a little slower now, a little softer, like it knows you're tired. You shift just slightly, eyes closed. The echo of visions and incense, lingering only as warmth in your chest. There's nothing more to understand tonight. No more strange brews. No chanting monks. No glowing-eyed geese to interpret. Just this moment. This stillness. This long, earned breath. You've wandered through centuries of hope and hallucination. Two of herb gardens and holy visions. Of confusion and curiosity. You've met saints and skeptics. You've seen belief take root in places where science has yet to tread. And now, finally, you rest. Let your shoulders sink. Let your thoughts unwind. Let the night cradle you, like the gentle shadow of a cathedral's cool nave. You are not lost. You are home. Sleep now. Dream slow. And if you hear a goose honk in your dreams, well, That's probably just Gregory. Sweet dreams.